She had not spoken in 11 days. Her husband noted it in his journal not with alarm at first, but with a kind of exhausted observation, the way a man records weather. She sits by the wall. She does not answer when spoken to. The children have stopped trying. The wind has not stopped in 6 weeks. He wrote that last line twice, on 2 separate pages, as if writing it once had not been sufficient to make it real. The wind has not stopped in 6 weeks. And somewhere between those 2 entries, his wife had gone somewhere inside herself that he did not have the language or the medicine or the understanding to follow her into. The Kansas prairie had not touched her with a single visible hand. It had simply surrounded her, completely and without interruption, until the person she had been ceased to function. Welcome to the raw frontier. Today we are going inside the quietest catastrophe the American frontier produced. No weapon, no disease, no physical violence of any kind, just space and silence broken only by a sound that never, ever stopped. You are going to discover how the Great Plains consumed the mental architecture of thousands of men and women who had survived every physical hardship the West could manufacture, and then were destroyed by nothing more than the particular quality of the air around them. The condition had a name, Prairie Madness, and by the time a family recognized it in one of their own, it was almost always too late to do anything except watch. The image that the American frontier's promotional literature sold to families in the 1860s and 1870s was specific, and it was beautiful, and it was almost entirely a construction. The pamphlets distributed by railroad companies and land speculators described the Great Plains in language borrowed from paradise. Rich soil, limitless horizon, a place where a family with determination and a modest investment in equipment could stake a claim and build something permanent, something that belonged to them in a way that nothing back east ever had. The illustration showed tidy wooden cabins with smoke rising from stone chimneys, and children playing in grass that was somehow always green, and always the right height, and always perfectly still. There were no trees on the Great Plains. This was not a detail the promotional literature emphasized. The eastern edge of the territory had some timber along the river corridors, but pushed west into the open prairie, and the landscape became what it actually was, a flat, largely featureless expanse of grass that extended to every horizon with consistency that the human eye evolved in environments with landmarks and variation, and the visual interruption of topography found deeply and increasingly difficult to process over extended periods. There was nowhere to build with. There was no stone easily accessible in most locations. There was the earth itself, and there was the grass growing out of it, and there was the sky above it, and there was a wind moving through all of it without anything in its path to slow it down. The shelter that pioneers built from these materials was called a sodai, a sod house. The construction process involved cutting the prairie grass into blocks along with the dense root system below it, roots that had been interweaving and compacting for centuries, and that held the soil together with a grip that made the blocks structurally viable as a building material. These blocks were stacked into walls. The roof was more sod laid over a framework of whatever timber could be sourced or salvaged, thin poles and branches, and whatever a family had brought with them or could trade for. The floor was the earth itself, packed by foot traffic into something approaching solidity. The result was a structure that was, by any measure applied to it, a hole in the ground with pretensions. There were no windows in most sodis, or windows that admitted so little light as to be functionally equivalent to none. The interior existed in a state of permanent dim twilight, regardless of what the sun was doing outside. The walls wept moisture in wet weather and crumbled fine dust in dry weather. The smell was a compound of everything the earth around a working frontier homestead accumulated. Animal waste used as fuel. Because it was unavailable, the bodies of the people living in close quarters with inadequate means of cleaning themselves or their clothing. The particular organic smell of soil that has been enclosed and has begun to process everything in contact with it. When it rained outside, it rained inside. Not immediately and not as clearly defined drops, but as a seeping, oozing infiltration to the sod roof that converted the ceiling and the walls into active sources of liquid mud. This process continued for days after the outside rain had stopped. Families covered their food. They repositioned their sleeping areas. They accepted, with the resignation that the frontier demanded of everything, that their shelter was doing what it was going to do, and that there was no solution available that the materials permitted. The biology of the sod roof was its own specific nightmare. The root systems in the ceiling blocks were not dead. They were dormant or they were dying slowly, and in either state, they provided habitat for everything that lived in prairie soil. Snakes, drawn by the warmth of the structure and the availability of the rodents that also inhabited the walls and ceiling, were a documented and consistent presence, not occasional visitors. Residents, families reported finding them embedding on furniture, falling from the ceiling during the night onto sleeping children, discovered in the morning in the spaces where food was stored. The psychological burden of living in a structure where the ceiling was capable of delivering living things onto your body while you slept is not a burden that a person calibrates to over time. It is a burden that accumulates without resolution day after day because the conditions producing it never change. The centipedes and the insects that came with them were constant. The rodents were constant. The smell was constant. The darkness was constant. And above all of it, penetrating every wall and every moment and every attempt to concentrate or rest or maintain any internal equilibrium, the wind was constant. On the Great Plains, there is nothing to stop the wind. This is a geographical fact of the same order as the absence of trees. The topography that would interrupt the prevailing airflow, the mountains, the ridgelines, the dense forest, simply does not exist across hundreds of miles of open prairie. What this means in practice is that the wind is not weather in the sense that most people understand weather. It is not a condition that arrives and passes. It is the ambient state of the environment, present at varying intensities but never absent, never fully quiet, never giving the nervous system the silence it requires to reset. The sound it produces in the absence of anything to break it against is a sustained high register tone that penetrates structures and fills interior spaces, and does not diminish with distance from the walls, because there is no interior point sufficiently removed from the walls of a sod to create meaningful acoustic insulation. Settlers who wrote about the wind in their journals and letters returned to it with a consistency that suggests it was not background noise. It was foreground noise. It was a primary sensory experience of every waking hour and a significant portion of the sleeping ones. Some described it as a voice. Some described it as a presence. Some stopped describing it and simply noted its continuation, day after day, in the flat, exhausted shorthand of people who had run out of language for something that never changed. The visual environment compounded every other pressure. The prairie in its natural state offers the eye a spectrum of yellows and browns and the occasional muted green, extending in every direction to a horizon that is always the same distance away regardless of how far you walk toward it. There are no landmarks to navigate by in the way that human spatial cognition evolved to use landmarks. There are no interruptions to the visual field that allow the brain to parse distance and position in the way it was built to. People got lost within sight of their own homes in conditions of poor visibility. Children wandered into grass and did not come back. The landscape did not merely fail to orient you. It actively disoriented, replacing the environmental cues that allow a person to feel located in space with an undifferentiated sameness that extended past the horizon in every direction. The nearest neighbor was often 10 miles away. On horseback in good weather, this was an hour. In the other conditions that the prairie routinely produced, it was effectively unreachable. Communities of the kind that human beings require for psychological maintenance, the casual contact, the shared labor, the conversation that confirms you exist in relation to other people, were not available on the terms that the frontier's geography permitted. A family staking a claim in a Kansas or Nebraska or Dakota territory was not moving into a community with some inconvenient distance between its members. They were moving into a condition of isolation that had no precedent in anything their nervous systems had been prepared for. The men left. This is a pattern so consistent across the accounts of the period that it functions as a structural feature of the prairie experience rather than an individual decision. They went to town for supplies. They went to seek work during the seasons when the homestead did not require their constant presence. They went to check on equipment, to trade, to conduct a business that maintaining a frontier claim required. The trips were necessary. They were also, in some number of cases, relief that the men did not fully articulate and the women did not fully express, because expressing it would have required acknowledging what the prairie was doing to everyone inside it. The women stayed, with the children, in the sod with the darkness and the smell and the ceiling that could deliver things onto your body while you slept, and the wind that had been going on for so long that memory of a world without it had begun to feel like a dream rather than a prior reality. The progression that contemporaries called Prairie Madness and that modern psychological frameworks would recognize as a compound result of prolonged sensory deprivation, social isolation, sleep disruption, and accumulated environmental stress operating on a nervous system without any of the resources normally available to manage such pressures, did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as a sequence. The crying came first. Not grief crying. Not cry in response to a specific loss or pain, but the kind of crying that simply happens, that begins without identifiable trigger and continues without producing the relief that crying is supposed to produce. Settlers who noted this in family members often attributed it to fatigue or illness and expected it to resolve. It did not resolve. Apathy followed. The withdrawal from the activities that had previously structured the day, the cooking and the cleaning and the maintenance of whatever domestic order the Sadai permitted, replaced by a stillness that was not rest. The person was present in the body, but conducting less and less of the behavior that indicated engagement with the environment around them. Then the perceptual distortions. The prairie is an environment with a long, unbroken horizon in every direction and a sound that fills every silent space. And when mind under sufficient stress begins to generate its own content to fill the gaps in external stimulation, the output is shaped by what the environment provides. Women heard voices in the wind, not metaphorically, specifically, the voices of people who were not there, speaking with an urgency that demanded response. The long grass became inhabited by presences that moved at the edge of vision and were gone when looked at directly. The interior of the Sadai, already dimensionally ambiguous in the permanent dim light, acquired occupants that the other people in the household could not confirm. The documented cases from the period are specific enough to constitute a pattern. A woman in Nebraska who had not spoken voluntarily in 3 months was found by her husband one morning standing in the open field in her night clothes in January, facing away from the house, perfectly still, in temperatures that were actively dangerous to exposed skin. She offered no explanation when brought inside. She did not acknowledge that anything had occurred. A woman in Dakota Territory set fire to the family's sod house in the middle of a winter afternoon while her children were outside. She was not attempting to harm anyone. When asked afterward what she had done and why, she said she had needed the wind to stop, as if the burning of the structure that had enclosed her would remove the walls between herself and the sound that had been inside her head for so long that she could no longer locate its source as external. The journals of husbands who watched this progression in their wives carry a consistent emotional quality that is not accusation and not incomprehension. It is something closer to witnessing, the record of a person watching something happen to someone they love with the full knowledge that they do not have the tools to intervene and that the environment producing it is not going to change. He notes the date she stopped speaking. He notes the date she stopped eating without being prompted. He notes the date he realized that the woman sitting in the corner of the Sadai was using her eyes in a way that suggested she was seeing something in a room that he could not see. For those who reached the end of this progression and remained alive, the destination was often the frontier asylum. The institutions that received them were not equipped for what they were being asked to manage. Frontier mental health facilities in the 1870s and 1880s operated with a combination of physical restraint, isolation, and the available pharmacological tools of the period, most of which have been detailed elsewhere in this channel's history. The diagnosis applied to women admitted from the prairie territories was often cabin fever, or simply exhaustion, or nerves, as if the mechanism were a malfunction of individual constitution, rather than the predictable output of an environment that had exceeded what the human mind was built to withstand. The American frontier offered land. It offered space so vast that the concept of limitation seemed to have been left behind in the East with everything else. It offered the specific American promise that distant from the old world and the old constraints was itself a form of freedom for the people who built their lives on the Great Plains. The space was real. The distance was real. The freedom was not. The open prairie was not liberation. It was a different kind of enclosure, one without walls that could be located and tested and eventually breached, one that pressed inward from every direction simultaneously, with no form of pressure that could be physically resisted. The largest prison ever built was the one with no fences and no ceiling, and a horizon that was always the same distance away no matter how long you walked toward it. They did not break because they were weak. The people who crossed 2,000 miles of continent to stake a claim on the Great Plains and then endured everything the prairie produced were not a population lacking resilience. They broke because the environment they were living in was specifically and comprehensively hostile to the requirements of human psychological function in ways that no prior human experience had prepared anyone to recognize or resist. The mind needs variety. It needs contact. It needs the relief of silence after sound and the comfort of enclosure that is chosen rather than imposed. The prairie offered none of these things. It offered wind and distance, and the particular sound that enters through walls that are made of earth and does not stop. What would do it for you? The wind that has been going for 6 weeks and shows no sign of stopping, that has moved from background noise into a presence you can no longer locate outside yourself. Or the ceiling above your bed, 3 inches of packed earth and root systems, alive in a way that a body is alive, capable of delivering something onto your face in the dark. You know which one your nervous system answers to. Leave it in the comments. And if you believe the isolation was the deepest wound the frontier could deliver, consider what the families in those sod houses were taking to manage their pain and their sleeplessness and their nerves. The bottles on the shelf of every frontier general store contain relief of a specific and ultimately devastating kind. And the people pouring those doses had no idea what they were actually swallowing. Click on our video about the real medicine of the Old West. The poison inside those elegant glass bottles destroyed quietly what the prairie took months to reach. Raw, visceral, history. This is a raw frontier.